Okay, so welcome everyone to our public presentation on the long-range facility plan. We have our consultants with us this evening, and Trustee Howe is going to start the meeting with the traditional welcome. Oh, you're muted, Sergey.
Hi, good evening, everyone. The Board of Education acknowledges that we are on the traditional territories of the Comox First Nation. We'd like to thank them for the privilege of living on their land and the gift of working with their children.
Thank you, Trustee Howe. So, the long-range facility plan, we did an update to the plan a few years ago, and then with all the changes in the valley and all the people moving in, we felt it was time to look at updating. So we contracted with Cascade to do an update to the long-range facility plan. So we've been working on it for a few months, and we have a draft plan that was presented to the Board of Education at their May 25th board meeting. And we have the consultants here this evening. We have Bill Loeb and Joel Palmer here to do a PowerPoint presentation and walk us through the current update to the long-range facility plan. So I will turn the meeting over to Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Yes, we're very pleased with the results of the plan and the options that were presented to the board for their consideration. Joel is going to walk everybody through a PowerPoint presentation which summarizes 3 or 4 months of work. So I'll hand it over to Joel.
Thanks, Bill. Ian, you have that teed up? There it is. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so slide 2 is just a brief introduction, again, of Bill and I, just to give you a sense of who we are and what kind of background we bring. And so Bill has been president of Cascade Facilities Management for about 15 years, 15 to 20 years, and has done many long-range facilities plans for school districts and for municipalities, and has, prior to that, 15 years experience with equipping school districts. So Bill brings that side of things. I spent a good portion of my career with the provincial government, most of it in public sector capital management, and most of that with the Ministry of Education. So I bring that perspective of sort of a good understanding of what the ministry needs to see from school districts in their long-range facilities plans. So just to give you a brief idea of what you'll see today. So we'll start just by going over what a long-range facilities plan is. Some of the components of it. Most of the meat of it will be the review of the draft Lrfp and analysis of the options. And to be clear, they're just options. These are just things that, these are just pathways that were determined to be viable and feasible. And so it doesn't mean that they all have to be followed, or eventually you have to follow one of them. But the goal of an Lrfp is to present some options and different ways of achieving goals and objectives with your facilities. And then we'll go on to some recommendations and then what an implementation plan might look like. So what is an Lrfp? Well, at the top, it's a strategic plan. It should align with strategic planning in the district and beyond. It should look at trends and demographics and your educational programming and how those can be accommodated in facilities that you have or the ones that you might need. The purpose of it is really around facilities and what sort of changes would be needed to accommodate that education delivery that is part of your strategic objectives and your role as a school board and a district. And so that would include new schools or renovations or other changes to facilities that might be required to run as efficiently as possible, but also to accommodate the students that you need to accommodate. And it's important to emphasize that a long-range facilities plan, although the ministry requires it, it really is a school district document. There's obviously an obligation to do a good job with it and to be accurate and to look at all the various options, because the ministry will ask about all those options and whether they've been considered. But it really is a school district document. And it's school district's prerogative to take it in the direction they'd like. So the components of an LRFP, so initially you need internal consultation, look at the assemble or the information that's available. That includes looking at demographics, of course, specifically 10-year enrollment projections of school-age children. That's the key driver in much of this, besides facilities, of course, and they work together to help you make the decisions you need. And from that, you're able to develop some preliminary options anyway, and then turn those into some feasible options, shortlisted options, you could say. And then, of course, some recommendations as to what direction to go in the future. So some of the things that are important to consider, and this list is maybe not exhaustive. It might look exhaustive, but it's not maybe even exhaustive. But first of all, like I suggested, the alignment with strategic goals for the district and for the government is important. Of course, the condition of your facilities, existing facilities, is really important. Being in the seismic zone, seismic risk is an important consideration for Comox Valley School District. Other population projections, but specifically school age projections, those being enrollment forecasts for K-12, which leads you into then school capacities and the utilization percentages of those schools, which helps guide you in determining where you have pressure and where you might have pressure in the future. We also need to look at different things that the school district could do to address some of those pressures, such as changing grade structures and configurations. District programming, are you able to move some programs around from school to school that would help alleviate pressures at one school and maybe fill up some space at another school? Then there's capital planning implications, and those include things like funding and timelines. I mean, you can't do everything all at once. It's just not feasible, and you're not likely to get great piles of money all at once, so you have to be thoughtful and realistic in how you plan out the 10 years. So just to start with, this is a good visual of the pathways that currently exist, the status quo in the district, and the pathways that students take. And so I'd kind of start with the bottom zone, or the rural zone. And obviously the two island schools, Miracle Beach, they all moved to Vanier after the K-7. We've got Royston moving to Cumberland, and then all of Cumberland moving on to Vanier as well. Up above, you have other schools, of course, matriculating into Vanier. You've got UBand and Quinish. And then Courtney, Arden, and the English track of College Park moving through Lake Trail and then on to Vanier. Isfeld, of course, has the French Stream from College Park as well as Rob Road, and then the Valley View piece. And then you can see in the top right there the three elementaries that moved to Highland. So that's the current status, current situation. We'll look at some varieties. We'll look at that type of diagram again later on, just to give a sense of what other options might look like. So briefly, yes, just there's clear alignment with this Lrfp and ministry's policy for student success, which is really the ministry's strategic plan. And the key piece of that would be healthy and effective learning environments. But importantly, it's also very much aligned with the SD71 strategic plan, as you can see there. The goal in particular of optimizing infrastructure to support learning, as well as the actions underneath that. So no question that it's well aligned strategically. In terms of facility condition, you can see in the little box there, the provincial average is about 0.44 and the SB71 average is 0.46. And what that means, that's essentially the cost of the requirements in the school over the cost of replacement. And so the higher the score, the closer to 1 the score is, the worse condition the school is in. So you can see on the far right, the schools with higher scores, probably some of the older schools. But that being said, sometimes one minor capital project, for instance, a roof replacement, can bring that number down substantially. So sometimes it just means that there's one major requirement that's needed to be done. FCI is not a proxy for replacement. It won't tell you per se, what schools need to be replaced soonest. But it's one of the factors you would certainly look at in that replacement question. And of course, the seismic program, seismic risk is an important consideration in the long-range facilities plan. You can see in the list there the 3 schools that have already been completed, Vanier being the most recent one, the 2 that are under construction. Hornby is on there because prior to the fire, it was a seismic risk. It was a high seismic risk, and it's on the ministry's list. And so Lake Trail and Hornby are under construction. And then you can see those schools that are still yet to be done, yet to be addressed. They do have some seismic risk. And just because they're a high priority for seismic doesn't mean that the entire school is high priority necessarily. Sometimes it's just one block. It could be the gym, it could be a small classroom block. So it's not necessarily the entire school that is at risk. You can see from this chart, and note that this is BC Stats data. So if you start with the top line, that's the oldest cohort, that's the 15 to 9-year-olds. This is a forecast over the next 10 years. You can see that the recent growth in elementary is going to carry through with future growth in the secondary and even middle for a period of time. But the interesting piece here is the BC Stats forecast is for declining elementary school enrollment over the 10-year period. So that's an interesting piece that maybe catches some by surprise because there has been so much recent growth. And this busy chart has all the different. So the previous slide was just BC Stats and it was by cohort. This is the entire. This is projections for the entire school-age children population for all the enrollment and the percentage per year expected growth. So you can see the purple line is BC Stats, and it quite quickly drops below 0. The ministry projection is the sort of teal color, and you can see it's not quite as pessimistic. Like it stays with positive growth for about halfway through the plan. Beauregard is the top line there, the sort of red maroon line. And Beauregard is a company that does demographic forecasting, and they specialize in that. And so they'll take into account much more than the ministry and BC Stats would. So they would look more carefully at housing starts and speak with municipal governments and get a more detailed view of what's expected. And so you can see their projection is quite optimistic. We've taken all of that and created what we call a cascade projection, which we think is we're the most confident with. And you can see the positive growth runs about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the 10 years before it dips below 0. And so anticipating a few more years of growth still in the district, but not huge growth, still less than 1.5% per year. This table shows sort of by categories compared to the baseline. So you can see on the bottom there what schools fall into which categories. Are they sort of below the baseline? Are they at the baseline? Are they above? Or are they well above? And so the ones that are expecting the highest growth are Courtenay and Puntledge and Cumberland and Lake Trail and Vanier and Highland under the current pathways. And so this graph doesn't look all that exciting, but I think the main takeaway from this is, and it's important, is you know, the forecast is for a little bit of growth for a few years and then stable environment. You know, not any drastic decrease or increase in enrollment. This can obviously change. There are factors that can change this. If there was an employment situation that changed one way or the other, you know, a whole bunch of new jobs in the community or a loss of jobs in the community, this will always obviously change throughout the 10-year plan, but we have every reason to believe at the moment that it looks fairly stable after a few more years of growth here. The other factor is the COVID factor in all of this as well. It really remains to be seen quite what kind of a long-term impact that has on demographics. So just to go through some important terms that you need to understand for a long-range facilities plan. So the ministry uses two types of capacity when they look at a school. There's nominal or what's sometimes called design capacity, and what that is what was the school designed to accommodate, and that's based on 25 students per classroom, full stop. So it's really just a standard calculation. Count the number of classrooms times 25, that gives you your capacity. It's obviously not realistic, but what it gives the ministry is sort of a level playing field to kind of compare district against district, because when you get to what we call operating capacity, that takes into account your local collective agreement and what your class size requirements are and things like that, and that'll give a slightly different number. In the past, when it was in legislation, it was based on 19 kindergarten students per class, 21 in primary, 25 in the rest. But with the change in the Supreme Court decision in 2016, now every district can have different class size and composition requirements, and so the operating capacity is a little bit trickier to calculate, and it makes it hard to compare across districts. So just that last bullet there is important to understand as well, is the ministry, when they're making decisions on, you know, how to allocate funding for new schools and additions, they really look at the utilization in the family of schools. So just for instance, if you have a school that is, you know, running at 140% and oh my gosh, we need an addition, but there's a school or two down the road that are, you know, well within what we call the family of schools that are only operating at 70%, the ministry would ask, you know, why is that, and what could be done to address that that imbalance between the overcapacity of one school and the undercapacity of another school, and that's the type of thing that the long-range facility plan has to look at. And ministry staff will ask school district staff to explain and help to understand why the utilization in a family of schools is really high or not. So this table shows you the capacity utilization for all the schools in the district, and you can see that overall the operating capacity utilization is 92%, which is good. That's over 90%. That's a well-utilized inventory of schools. There's always going to be, well, not always, but most districts have schools like Denman and Hornby that are outliers. They're rural, remote, or island schools, things like that. That you know, sometimes they're oversubscribed, but quite often they're undersubscribed. But you can't. They're not schools that you can legitimately close or do anything with, really. But you can look and see some of the other schools that are running at high capacity, like Royston and Miracle Beach, and those two being the primary ones. So this stack block chart shows you the elementary schools matriculating up to each of the 3 secondary schools and the middle school, community school at Lake Trail. And so the pink column on the left of each group is the capacity of those elementary schools, total capacity. And the orange, green, and yellow are the current 5-year and 10-year enrollment expectations for those schools. So for instance, if you look at the Lake Trail Community School group on the far left, the 3 elementary schools that are feeding that are have a fair bit of capacity to be able to manage into the future. The other three, the three secondaries, are, I would say they're fairly level. I mean, they're not experiencing big pressure or underutilized. Now, individual schools within those groups will have more or less pressure, but this gives you an idea of them combined feeding up to those other higher grade schools. And then this for the secondary schools, and Lake Trail again as well. So Lake Trail, you can see, is forecast to be somewhat underutilized into the future. So there may be an opportunity there. But you can see that the three secondary schools are forecasted to be over utilized into after about 5 years on the whole. So one thing to think about or remember with secondary schools is they can operate over 100%. There's things that happen in a secondary school with timetabling and online learning and other factors. Not, some students not taking a full schedule, where a secondary school can normally operate up to at least 110% fairly comfortably, and then after that it starts to become a bit challenging. So three of the main themes in the Lrfp. So one, of course, is managing enrollment growth. Your district has seen some significant enrollment growth in recent years, and that's created some pressures in certain areas. A look at the grade structure. Your grade structure in SD 71 is it's not as consistent as it is in some other districts, where it's just K to 7, 8 to 9, or sorry, 8 to 12 through the entire district, or the exact same elementary, middle, secondary grade configuration through the entire district. But that's not to say that you're an outlier, because there are other districts that have a variety of grade structures, and it happens over the years for good planning purposes and for good management purposes, and sometimes it works really well. So, but that is something that's a theme for sure in this long-range facilities plan. And then addressing the condition of facilities, that's always going to be a theme in any Lrfp. So the options. So again, these are just options. These are just ways the district could go. So the first option A is the status quo. So that will not require a ton of change, although there's some things that could happen, some changes that could happen within that status quo option that we'll talk about a little bit later. Option B, pardon me, is to go K to 7, 8 to 12 for the most part, except for keeping the K to 9 at Cumberland. And then options C and D are to move more to a middle school model. So there's some nuances between the two. The one being option C makes Quinish into a K to 9. So, and there's a few other little nuances there between C and D, but the general theme for those is to try and move to a more closer to a middle school model. So we can see each of them visually. This might help get a picture of them better than looking at that table. So this is the status quo option. So this is the same as we saw previously. Option B shows all the elementary schools going K to 7. And you can see all the ones that are, so all the rural zone, well, except for Cumberland, pardon me, remains K to 9. But all those rural zone schools matriculating to Vanier, along with Lake Trail Community School becoming a K to 7, changing from a middle to K to 7. Puntledge Park goes entirely to Isfeld, the dual track there. And I think Huban moves over to Highland under that option. So it's really trying to, as much as possible, create a K to 7, 8 to 12, not what you see in places like Surrey and Vancouver and several other districts. Option C, so this again is to attempt to create more of a middle school model, make all the elementaries K to 6. Cumberland again remains K to 9. Queenish becomes K to 9, and Lake Trail becomes becomes 7 to 9, with Highland converting to a middle as well. So you can see the different pathways that would result from that.
Yeah, I wasn't loading my new stuff.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. Is that a question?
No, okay. I think it was just an interruption. Go ahead.
Somebody off mute?
Yeah.
So I guess the other feature to note here is the only 2 secondary schools. And then option D, the same. Oh, sorry, we're already on it. The difference here being Queenish being the middle school rather than K to 9. It's the primary difference between C and D, right? All K to 6 elementaries, other than, again, Cumberland. So each of these produces different outcomes and different opportunities or threats, as you would see, but they're all feasible one way or another. And so the status quo option, the elementary overcapacity remains a problem at a few schools. Royston, Miracle Beach in particular, and there's still some undercapacity at a few schools you can see there on the elementary side. Cumberland remains a bit over capacity, and Lake Trail remains a bit under capacity. Vanier and Isfeld will soon exceed capacity, although I wouldn't say it would be by an alarming amount. But Highland remains under capacity, so there's some rebalancing that's not happening under the status quo option there at the secondary school level. Option B, though, you remain over capacity at the same elementary schools and under capacity. It doesn't really change any of that. And Vanier, well, if you drop down to the secondaries there, Vanier is over, and it's a little more balanced at the secondary level. Option C, the elementaries are the overcapacity issue of the elementaries is helped because they've lost a grade going from K to 7 down to K to 6 for a lot of them. And Lake Trail Cumberland remains slightly over capacity in all 4 options. The 2 secondaries become just 10 to 12 and seem to have enough capacity. So that would be Isfeld and Vanier. The difference being with option D, there's the elementaries are okay, but K to 6 students from Queenish can be accommodated in adjacent elementaries, so there's some balancing that's able to happen there. But I think the main note from this is that all the options are feasible. They all have some pros and cons, though, of course, as you would see with most options. So in order to try to get to a solution or to a recommendation, there's certain criteria that you need to consider, and so the first, of course, is students and programs being accommodated, and is that happening under the option that is favored, or is it happening, and to what extent is it happening in the option, and then you can give that a score, typically out of 5. Is family disruption minimized? That's a big issue, of course, because change is difficult, and if it requires years and years of disruption, then that's a factor. is the end result of the organization, particularly the grade configuration, is it more consistent than the existing? Number 4 is definitely important. Is capacity utilization improved? That is certainly one of the goals of a long-range facility plan, is to find an option that brings the district towards good capacity utilization. And then what about the cost for renovation and resources? That's obviously a factor. If the ministry doesn't have the money for you, or if you don't have the money internally, then to do certain options, then that has to be considered and scored. And so in the analysis of the shortlisted options, options B, C, and D require quite a few changes. Each of them, it envisions a fair bit of change, and so there'd be boundary changes, catchment revisions, facilities renovations, some costs with that. Option B would convert Lake Trail back to a K-7. That would create some issues, probably with the ministry a little bit as well, because of the recent project that was just done there. And then to convert it, they may find that decision a bit interesting. Option C, converting Highland to a middle school and Queenish to K-9, that's going to have some impacts and require changes. And then option D as well, similarly, is going to have significant impacts for people and changes for the district and parents and students to live with for a while. So option A is clearly it's the least disruptive option, and it's probably a good model. It's probably working okay, but there's still a few concerns that exist with this option. Particularly Royston and Cumberland remain over capacity with some surplus at Courtney and Arden. Vanier and Isfeld are at or over capacity with a bit of surplus space at Highland, so that imbalance still exists. And the varied grade structure still remains with the status quo option, the different grade configurations at different schools without the consistency. So earlier I talked about families of schools, and one of the clear pressures in the district is at Royston and Cumberland, and this here shows you the schools that the ministry staff would likely look at in terms of family schools, and how to assess the capacity utilization problem at Royston, for instance, and you can see that Cumberland K-7 is over by 35 students, which isn't terrible, but with further enrollment growth, that could get worse. Royston is a small school and operating quite a bit over capacity, so there's a clear challenge with that pressure. But then moving on to Courtney and Arden and Tunbridge, but especially Courtney Elementary, there's quite a bit of capacity there, so there may be ways to fix that balance a little bit. And then looking at the secondary schools, this is all 3 secondary schools, you can see again that really none of them are terribly over or under capacity. The Highland is under capacity. It gives you a little bit of opportunity maybe to balance things if this challenge gets worse over time, but really not any drastic over or under capacity at the secondary school level. So the proposed recommendation is option A, to stay with the status quo configuration, but with a couple of recommendations to help with a lot of it is balance. So looking at some options for improving the balance between Highland and Vanier, maybe looking at some changes potentially to which elementary schools feed those secondary schools. Maybe some opportunity to balance the capacity utilization of those 2 schools a bit better. And then the other is with West Courtney and Cumberland, some possibilities for adjusting catchment areas to relieve some pressure, particularly at Royston. And then this is just an implementation plan. It's probably pretty hard to see, but it does give an idea of some of the things that could happen. The capital projects section there is, of course, contingent on any ministry funding that would be requested and getting approval for that. So those timelines would be contingent on receiving approval for those funds. And that brings us to the end. I'm happy to take some questions, and I'm sure Bill and the staff from ST71 could assist in certain areas too, but happy to try and answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Bill and Joel, for the presentation. It looks like Trustee Waite has a question, so go ahead, Trustee Waite.
Okay, so I have 4 questions, but I'll ask one and then let all the other folks who have questions ask. Some are, I guess, more curiosities than others. So my first question is, and thank you for this, and you're likely aware that we went through a fairly extensive boundary consultation process in the past few years. And so was that information that the district gathered from our community and some of those recommendations, was that provided to Cascade with the information, the rest of the information that was provided by the district?
Yes, we were well aware of the issues that the board had to deal with in the recent past, in the last 2 years, and it revolved around the same concern with West Courtney and Royston areas. But we have to look at it as an outsider with an objective point of view and look at what's actually happening in the district and what the enrollment forecast shows versus capacity. So it's incumbent on us to point this out and leave it to you guys to make a decision as to how you move forward with the information we provided.
Trustee Crowley?
I have a few questions as well, so I'll start with one. So when you were saying, so in the notes about Courtney Elementary and the capacity being reduced significantly by community use programming, what exactly is that programming? And if we're in excess capacity of 148, if we were to take that space, if we were able to somehow fill those 148 seats, does that mean that the programming that you're talking about that's being used moves somewhere else, or is there still space because it's not necessarily during school hours?
I think I'd like Ian to speak to that.
Thank you. There's several programs at the school right now. We have Strong Start, Jump Start, and Indigenous preschool, and we have 1,000 by 5, which is where the books are prepared by a group that Mr. Douglas looks after. And there is a childcare that uses an empty classroom before and after school. So it would. We also have the challenge program at the school, and a room set aside as an art room. And we also have one classroom as well that serves as a kitchen. So there's a number of options for manipulating the space, but eventually we would be looking to to relocate some of those programs to another spot. It's been a very, I think, convenient and well-used portion of the school for quite a few years. And Mr. Douglas, did I miss any of the groups that are operating out of there? Okay, thanks.
No, you got them all. And thanks, Ian, for that comprehensive list of everything that you found there.
The only other thing that we might want to add is that we do have a Montessori program that has just started in that school, and that will continue to grow as we progress.
So for clarification, sorry, I see you there, Janice. So when you're looking at the family of schools and the capacity utilization, are things like that taken into account because those spaces are still being utilized and they kind of connect with schools in a sense? So how does that play out?
That's a very good question, and I asked that question to the ministry recently, and essentially what they look at, there's certain ministry programs such as Strong Start where there's a mandate for us to operate that program out of the schools, but the majority of those programs are not core to the K-12, and so they do not count in our capacity. What we can do though is make arguments for local knowledge around the school site, and you can say that there might be particular rooms or particular issues in a community that need to be served, but really they're looking at just the building. You know, you have a 15 classroom school and you have 8 divisions in it, so you have space.
And especially if it looks like there's space elsewhere in the district that could accommodate some of the district programs, that would be important. And if the district is looking for additional space, such as the potential expansion of the number of classrooms at Cumberland and at Royston, they will definitely look at the family of schools to see if space could be created by moving programs.
Trustee Wade, I know you had more questions. Did you want to ask another question?
I think Trustee Payton had a question.
Oh, okay. Trustee Payton?
So Tanya actually kind of touched on what I was going to ask. Looking at the family of schools and the ones that are looking over capacity, and you're looking at Miracle Beach, and you're looking at Royston, and you're looking at Cumberland, looking at the new development that's going around there, and looking at the possible barriers, looking at the input of housing and students coming in there. The reality is there, if we don't look at possible boundary changes, because we have extra spaces at other schools, if we decide to put portable, say, at Huband or Royston or Cumberland to accommodate those extra students at $300,000 pop, that's close to $1 million of money out of our operational, which could provide counselors and teachers, and that's the reality we're looking at. My question is time frame and looking at the possible subdivisions in the building they're going on in those areas. Part of you're looking at this process is, and I'm looking at the barricades and the numbers on that one there. And I'm looking at Arden School. A few years ago, Arden was like verging at the seams, and we were over capacity, and now it's under capacity. How confident are we the numbers that we're talking about are pretty well consistent, or is we're looking at some flexibility? Because my concern is that we project students coming into school, we look at that, and in fact it's more retired people. So that was my looking at those 3 schools, the ones that we're talking about, like Royston and Miracle Beach and Cumberland, looking at an area, how confident are we that the projections that we're looking at and the numbers coming in there are going to be what they are?
Well, many times we have to emphasize that enrollment projections are an art, not a science, and many factors can change the impact on various schools. Another thing to keep in mind, the community, the municipality, and developers are always way more optimistic about families moving in to new developments and the pace of construction of those new homes than what really happens in the end. And the third factor is a lot of new accommodation is taken up by existing population. That might result in a move of families from one part of the district to another, but you cannot say, look at a housing development of 50 homes and think that there's 50 families moving into Comox Valley. That wouldn't be the case. The main driver of the total population in the valley is employment opportunity. And as was mentioned during the presentation, a change in employment for the parents of the students, either increased opportunity or reduced opportunity, is the biggest factor driving population, family population, not retirement, but student age population. So I think in summary, yes, we're looking at those developments in that part of the district, and it's the timeline is probably longer than what you might hear from boosters in the community. And secondly, we have to consider that a lot of the new occupants of those subdivisions are just moving within the district. I hope that answers the question. Does Ian or Joel have an additional comment? Brenda?
So I just wanted to add that some of the things we do know that are in the draft long-range facility plan are the average age of people in certain communities. For example, the average age in Comox was, I think, 58, and the average age in Courtenay was 54, but the average age in Cumberland was 44. So those are childbearing, families and so we can anticipate that trend is probably going to continue. We might see more families in the Cumberland area, which then would add to the overcapacity enrollment pressures in the West Courtenay area. And also, it would be interesting to look in detail at what the Ridge has yielded for enrollment in Royston, because we know that there's a couple more phases of the Ridge that are under plan. So, if we can see that though there is a certain amount of, that's a family type home that families choose, then that might inform us about decisions around potential boundary adjustments, etc. The other thing we've noticed in some trends is with the cost of housing, we're seeing that some communities are becoming more affordable than others. So now families are choosing Comox more than they would have chosen Comox before as a place to reside. So it is, Bill mentioned, it's constantly shifting, and we're constantly looking at our enrollment projections compared with our MyEd BC data to see, how that's going to unfold for September. But so far, our predictions for the coming year have held fairly true, if not been a little bit conservative. So, that'll help inform us as we go forward. Ian, did you have anything else? Okay. So, well, I see you've got another question, Trustee Foley, but maybe we'll go back to Trustee Wade for another question before we come to you.
Okay, thank you. So I have it's a two-prong, and it goes in two different directions. The first is the public was offered opportunity, we've provided notice of the meeting tonight, and the opportunity to, I believe, submit questions. So I have a question about what happens with those questions, and were they collated for tonight and answered during the presentation, or when will they be answered? And then my totally other question is, and it's about it's around page 77 and page 23 of the document, where it talks about capacities. And I remember when we went through the boundary consultation, we learned that the capacity utilization, I think, if I remember correctly, didn't include the modulars on site. And so when we did we actually adjusted our numbers for our presentation to include the seat capacity with including the modulars to give a truer number. So if these numbers on page 77 don't include seat count for modulars, and then I look at page 23, for example, with Isfeld has 6 modulars, and I know that there's I've heard a fair bit of information about modulars and you know some of the challenges or the less efficient a modular is than connected bricks and mortar. How do we navigate trying to look at these numbers without the modulars included? And then when we go to the page with all the modular information, what could somebody share about that piece? So I had two totally separate things, not intentional, but just curious about folks who were going to where those questions are landing.
Sure, I can those. Trustee Wade, we received one question in that out of the feedback. It was around sustainability in our facility work, and so it was kind of tangential to the long-range facility plan. So what I have done is I did not have an email address for the person, but the superintendent's going to send that to me so that I can respond directly and initiate a conversation with the person. So there was a very limited response to the open forum that we had on the website. And the second part is, it's a tricky one with the modulars. And this is a ministry document with ministry guidance around how it should be set up. And when the ministry is assessing our projects, they always do it against the operating capacity or the nominal or design capacity. They don't want modulars factored in because within the design or the operating capacity, it really takes into account, and you alluded to that, the key functions of the school is that when you have a school that's designed, say, for 15 divisions, the design is somewhat formulaic, and you get a certain size of gymnasium, you get a certain number of washrooms, you get a certain number of storage space and hallway width and all those good things. And the challenge being when we put a half dozen modulars on the site, and Isfeld's a great example, is that you don't get another science lab, or you don't get another bit of multi-purpose exercise space, or the library doesn't get bigger. And that's one of the real challenges at Royston right now we face, is that the gymnasium is small, the library is small, the hallways are skinny, and it's tricky with washrooms. And so in the report, we strove for the consistency of what the ministry would like, and that being announcing and doing our numbers versus capacity that is the true bricks and mortar. Because we've resolved, we make Royston work. You know, it's almost 50% of our capacity, but we have a significant group of modulars there. But we're up against the wall. You know, our sewage system we're almost at capacity with the modulars we have, and certainly the gym is small. So we wrestle with that question, but we default back to when we do our project request fact sheets or a business case through the PDR for more space, it has to be just against our bricks and mortar, and so that's why we elect not to include the modulars. But we do acknowledge that we have quite a few modulars in the system.
Superintendent?
I think with regard to any additional questions we get tonight, the plan would be to collect them, answer them, and put them back on the website, just like we did during the conversation, so everybody can see the answers as well as the questions.
Trustee Keaton?
So thank you. Actually, Ian's comment on Royston perked my next question. When we're looking at the recommendation is option A with modifications, looking at Royston and adjusting the timeline. And Ian, you just alerted to the capacity of the school and the septic system, and having that hit I'm not saying a magic number, but at what point looking at the fact that you have your services, whether it's your septic system, your water, and all the other ones, and you're actually your property, because your property, you're dealing with building permits. At what point are these three schools that we're looking at, which are the ones that are looking at being over capacity, is there a time factor where we're looking at the septic system will not handle the capacity, whether the municipalities that will say no more adding additional on, you have to move forward? Is there been a time within the building system that we have to look at, okay, we have to make a choice because we cannot go any further? Is that something to, if we wait and do nothing, we may have to consider as a possibility?
I think the Royston's in a unique location, Trustee Caton, because of the fact that it is on a septic system. In Cumberland, we're on sanitary, so it reduces that challenge for us. But certainly when we have a sewerage system like we do at Royston, there is a hard capacity of the number of people, because they don't really differentiate between kids and students the students and the staff a little bit, but it's predominantly students. And we have to, every time put in a building permit there, which is each time we add a modular, we have to do a full registered wastewater professional report on the system, assuring that it's working properly and that it has the capacity. And because the rules are changing, it's really hard for me to declare right now where our max number is, because they're getting more conservative over time. But we do have a little room there still. We're okay for the time being. But
okay, and then just the follow-up to Miracle Beach. Miracle Beach is a rural school, and I'm not sure how their field is. I know that their water, so beach, would that be in the same scenario as Royston being, or do they have like sewer and water, which is not quite as hard hit as
we don't have the water challenges we have at Miracle Beach, and we haven't come up against the same septic challenges at Miracle Beach because it's growing so much more slowly. We only have the one modular there. So, and we're working in partnership with the CBRD right now to have a new water line through our school site to service some of the property off of Schultz Road. You'll know there's that area back there, and so we're going to have actually a better water supply to the school within the next year. But the septic side is always a worry because it's significantly expensive, and we can't really replace it with a like system that we have today because the rules have changed an awful lot.
And the other thing to remember about adding more portables is not only the fixed cost to purchase it, the $350,000 or $400,000 that comes out of operating dollars, but it also adds to our annual maintenance costs and annual custodian costs. It's they tend to take more for upkeep, and it's they're having a lot of portables is a lot more difficult than having it all in one building. Extra heating costs, extra electricity, extra custodial, all those things add up to fixed costs for the district overall. Okay, so Trustee Wade, did you have another question?
Thanks. And I wanted to say, I really got distracted in the document, and I went down all sorts of places, like reading about the demographic information and the average age and the median age in the different areas of the valley and the changes and things. And so it's a really comprehensive document that I think can be used for all sorts of different things. And so I don't know if this is always how extensive they are, or you just provide everything that you needed to look at to provide the information. But I just want to say that I really found it useful, and I've read through it a couple of times, and I've got all sorts of highlights and things marked everywhere. I hope nobody ever has to copy mine. But one of my questions, and it's to do with the high schools, and then it'll link in a little bit to the option about changing where an elementary school goes to high school. So on page 99 of the document, it refers to, and I'm a little confused about this, it refers to it, I think it says Isfeld and Vanier are relatively close to each other. I think that's what it means, and that the freedom of choice regarding attendance. And I thought we had closed the boundaries off for Vanier. And so, and Tom, thank you for nodding to help my memory. But I'm wondering about like the pressure with Vanier, and if and I'm no statistician, but thinking about I know we had a lot of struggle with one of the thoughts about routing the students way out in Miracle Beach to a different secondary school, and we heard the parents when that suggestion was offered, and so rather than moving an elementary school to transition to a different high school like Cuban to Highland, thinking about how do we could we move another school to align to Isfeld to take the pressure off Vanier, and then could we route other schools, say, to go to Highland, like break up Rob Road, like we do at Pole Puntledge, to go to Highland. And so I was just curious how, given that that Cascade is neutral and didn't hear a lot of that information and just looked at the facts, how did you come about that it was Cuban versus doing some sort of organization a little closer to Highland and maybe Isfeld and changing some of that? I'm just curious.
We did look at the feeder schools for the secondaries and considered several different options for which schools could be realigned to ease some of the pressures. And it was really the feedback and discussion with the senior management team, senior leaders team, in early negotiations about shortlisting the options that led us to make the recommendation we did. You mentioned Miracle Beach, for example. That was one of the ones that, as outsiders, we thought could feed to a different school. But in the end, it seemed that Huban would be the best option to look at, possibly redirecting.
The other thing that we looked at in depth was the long-term projections and capacities and all the different effects of each scenario. So in the final long-range facility plan document, you will see all of the options that were considered and rejected, not being brought forward just because the numbers didn't work at a certain level or for a certain school. So all that information is there. The other thing we can do, in case you're interested, is take a really good, have another meeting to have a really good in-depth look at all the different options and the numbers that we worked with, if there's some interest in doing that. So, Superintendent?
I was just going to say, Trustee Ray, Rob Road is a little bit different because it is single track school, so the entire school is immersion, so you can't really split that population. The problem by adjusting sort of to Vanier, then adjust to Isfeld, is Isfeld is only fed by the two immersion schools, so Puntledge and Rob, and Valley View. So to adjust, you'd be looking at, do you move Valley View, which is right next door, Aspen currently, which is the next closest one, Aspen on one side and Quinish. We could bring Quinish over, but then again, you're overpopulated at Isfeld. So you're really limited in terms of what feeder school you can move into the Isfeld catch. And I do believe Director Douglas will recall at one point in time, there was a split in the feed to Isfeld where kids literally could see Isfeld over their fence. And unfortunately, to highlight, you may have heard the old battle back and forth over the years. So that's why it came up with how do you adjust it. If you move the French immersion, which was another option, looking at moving the whole program, then your building, Highland wouldn't be big enough to have the French immersion and the neighborhood, which is right next door, being Brooklyn. So some of those things were considered. What's the best way of looking at it? And I think those were the discussions we ended up having with Cascade when they started looking at some of the options. Great question, though.
Trustee Payton?
So I have a question for Cascade, and maybe Joel can answer this one here. And then I have do a follow-up question. So we're kind of stuck because we have to do something. It's just a matter of what do we do. If we do nothing and we invest $1 million into portables, it's out of operational, and as Secretary, you said, there's a cost implication. We also have schools that are going to be under capacity, underutilized. And this is I need clarification, this one here. Is the ministry, my understanding, with the exception of a few districts, which I'm looking at Surrey and Souk as being those exceptional ones, if it's district our size is looking at expanding, adding on to schools or building something, does the ministry still have that looking out on district and our capacity, saying, well, when you've got a school that's 5 minutes down the road or 20 minutes down the road that's got 5 empty classrooms, we will not fund you that classroom down the road? Is that something that they still look at, or they consider the district asks for additions at schools, is looking at our overall capacity, especially when we're within a walk? Like I'm looking at Hugh Band to where when you look at the line of travel with Hugh Band in Airport in Highland, they're really not that far apart distance-wise. If you do that line, the way the crow flies. So as we make a decision, we look forward, one of the things that I need to know is, does the ministry still have that in the back of their mind? Well, you've got the room in your district, you've got 250 empty seats, we're not going to build you extra classrooms until you fix your own problem. Before I ask my second question, follow-up.
Yeah, so I guess the answer is somewhere in the middle there. I mean, the ministry's not going to penalize a district. Well, put it this way, they're not going to expect overcapacity at an elementary school in Comox to go to undercapacity on Hornby. I mean, there's a reasonableness about what the family of schools would be, and there's no magic number for the entire district. So if your entire district is, plus or minus 90%, it really isn't relevant. The ministry really looks at the family of schools and what is the pressure on that family of schools that's within a reasonable distance. So, you're not talking about island schools, you're not talking about schools that are remote, you're not talking about schools that even in an urban environment might have major highways between them and things like that. You're talking about schools that are within a reasonable catchment or family, and comparing that to Chilliwack, and comparing that to Souk, and comparing that to Surrey, and looking at those pressures, and the ministry trying to do as much as they can across the province to reduce the pressures in where they're most urgent. And that's where the ministry staff, the Ministry of Education capital staff, will start asking the skill testing questions about, well, have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about moving this program? Have you thought about changing the catchment area here? And then that's why you need to go through this exercise, is to consider those things, so that Ian and Brenda and Tom can then say, yes, we looked at that and here's why we can't do it.
So that's a good thing to know, because as we this discussion, because whatever we make, the impact, and I hate to say this, and Director Douglas, you and I have been through this many times, is when we look at what's best for the district or best for schools, you're looking at boundary changes and boundary catchments. People get that knot in their stomach, and it's kind of that on that one there. And I look at from the educational point of view is what resources can we give to our students in the classroom? I hate spending money on buildings when I can put it into the classroom with that counselor, with a support teacher, with the EA. So thank you for that clarification, because I think that you kind of answered one of my questions and concerns, is that we have to have the conversations, and if with our families or schools connected, and we have one school in that family that's under capacity, we have to show justification as to why we are not looking at a boundary shift if we're going to ask the ministry for money to add additions. Is that what I heard, kind of, sort of?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's right. And it gets back a little bit to the question about Courtney L and the programs that are in there, and you know, I'm sure they're all terrific programs. The challenge the ministry has is they don't want to be the arbiter of whether those programs are good or bad, or just filling space, or actually critical. It's really difficult for ministry capital staff to be that judge. Classrooms, Strong Start is a provincial program, so they take out Strong Start space, but everything else is considered available for K-12. So that'll affect your capacity utilization in your family. And no question, it makes for some really tough decisions sometimes.
And I think that point needs to be made a clarification, because when we're having these conversations at the board table, we trustees quite often have the information, but I think the community and the parents in the area understanding why we have to have these conversations and the impact it will have on them is very important. So the more information we have, and thank you, this has been really helpful tonight. The more informed you are, the better off you're able to explain what you're doing, what you're doing. And this is about ensuring our students are being taught in a space that's not crowded. And one thing that COVID-19 has taught us is you got to have spaces for your students. You cannot be overcrowded. They got to have that clean, healthy space. And when you've got, and as Director Hesselgrave talks, when you got one science lab, you need two. It all compounds to each other. So I think this is a difficult conversation and difficult topic, because nobody wants to change schools, but when your neighborhood is shifting, and when you used to have 20 kids in a neighborhood, now you're down to one, and the other neighborhood didn't have any, and you've got 22. You're right. You have to kind of match your families with your neighborhood schools. And I'm rambling. Sorry, but thank you very much. I really appreciate that information.
Those were good questions, Trustee Clayton. Trustee Wade?
This followed up, I think, from some of the questions and the answers that Trustee Clayton started. But it was and the numbers, I guess, to me again, I go back to the numbers in the report and looking at our sort of our high school numbers, and I see the growth in like Royston, Cumberland area, and the potential in Bay, and you know, the talk of, you know, if only we had a high school on this side of the river. And then when you look at the numbers, unless we had a high school that just we no longer should be operating, it doesn't look like in the long term even that's even feasible, because we don't show the number growth in the community, and we don't have a school that its FCI is so high that you know that it's not usable. And with consideration of the environment and busing and all of those kinds of things, and trying to locate schools closer to populations without having schools that you can just move around that are better than modulars, it feels like every district is going to struggle with this forever. And that high school on the other side of the river just probably won't happen in our lifetime. So it wasn't really a question, it was more about a comment about the numbers and how even in terms of trying to support our strategic plan about the environment, it's tricky when schools are in place and we can't just move them.
No, so that's true. There's so much to consider, and I think that was why option A was the option that senior staff was comfortable with, because it was the least disruptive option for most families in the district. And so with some adjustments to option A, then we could make it work for the foreseeable future. Assuming that there's not significant population growth or families moving into the area. So we have seen a very robust property market, and it'll be interesting to see how September actually unfolds. we have seen, you know, some additional growth at the elementary level, and you know, we'll see if that continues, the trend continues. But there's always so much to consider when you're looking at this, and we really appreciate the expertise of Bill and Joel in helping us navigate this. Ian has done a tremendous amount of work on the long-range facility plan that you have before you, and you know, because there's just so much to consider and so much information, data, demographics, trying to forecast, and you roll that all up into impacts on families and schools and students, and you know, what is the least impactful decision that we can make and consider. So go ahead, Bill.
The 2021 census is underway now, and next spring we should have new census data for all the communities. And everything that we looked at was based on 2016 plus educated projections by BC Stats and Barriger and everybody. But now, as happens every 5 years, you have an actual physical count of the people and families and children in your district. So I really recommend that next spring somebody get the updated data and check it against current projections, and then adjustments can be made. But in the meantime, everybody should be aware it's based on 2016 plus trends. Thank you.
Okay. Well, did we have other questions? Trustee Crowley had another meeting she had to attend, so she left about 7:30. Okay, well, did you want to do a wrap up? Oh, sorry, Trustee Wait, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to share that Trustee Hawksby and Trustee McDonald are at the DPAC meeting tonight.
Thank you. So did you want to do a wrap up, Bill? And then Ian?
I don't really have much more to say. I thought there were a lot of really good questions, and I know that the trustees, have looked through the report. I can tell from the questions that you spent time looking at what we've done. I think we are ready to finalize the report if the board is comfortable with the recommendations, and hopefully our project will be finished by the end of June. So thanks very much for everybody's attentiveness to this long-range facilities plan, and thanks Joel for facilitating 2 meetings so successfully, and thank you Brenda and Ian for all your help on this.
Okay, I just want to echo the thanks as well to Cascade and to Brenda for the support during this. It was a pretty busy time, and I think we have some additional steps we need to take. We have some information that I think we'll work with the superintendent and the Secretary of Treasury through to the board to get an understanding of where we sit now and where we want to be over the next while. And I think there's a feedback element from tonight we need to wait for and see what kind of public feedback we get, and then synthesize that and respond to those questions. And in the meantime, we'll continue to work towards finalizing the document. And there's some last sections that are very interesting that have, in particular, the options we considered but rejected outright because they simply weren't feasible. They were in the not feasible category, so we didn't want to sort of clutter the screen with those. Although we did consider many variations. So I appreciate everyone's time this evening, and thank you. We'll have more information coming out of the next week about how we'll wrap this project.
Yes, thank you. Well, good night everyone. Thank you very much for attending. Appreciate all the great questions, and stay tuned for more information. Thank you. Good night, Bill. Good night.